problems of society. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about the origins of science diplomacy, because I think more than anybody else, Fridtjof Nansen was the role model that started it all. An unusual person. I think it's unlikely we will ever see someone like this again, who was both a world-class athlete, a scholar, truly a neuroscientist at the leading edge of his work. He worked in the neuroanatomy at the point brain organization was totally obscure. It was his concepts that Santiago Hall subsequently won the Nobel Prize for. And of course he's famous for being an explorer, the designer of the Fram, the attempt to reach the North Pole. And here he is with Hjalmar Johansen on their way back to Tromsø after 2 years in the Arctic. A patriot, a leading voice for the independence of Norway, and a humanitarian, amazing humanitarian, who conceived of the Nansen Pass, a document where displaced refugees after World War I could maintain an identity and seek asylum, for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, I think I was about 10 or 12 years old when I first read a biography of Fridtjof Nansen, and it was striking. He's not so well discussed outside of Norway, but boy, he should be. So I grew up kind of with this idea of being a Nansen wannabe. I even had a Nansen-like mustache in my earlier days. Here I am canoeing in the subarctic in Canada with my son. And here I am a few years back. With any luck, this is what I'll look like next week when I ski the Vasaloppet in Sweden. I have better equipment than Nansen. I think he was a lot faster though. And when I had my mustache, I realized there was even a little resemblance. And trust me, this wasn't staged. There was a photographer wanted these formal portraits of me, which I begrudgingly agreed to. And later, I saw these pictures of Nansen. I got these pictures out. It gets worse. Yeah, I even have the Nansen's eyes. Well, I think that's where the comparison ends. But I think Nansen sparked something that any scientist should keep in mind. In addition to the laboratory work, where is the use of this in terms of society, and are there opportunities to use this to bridge societies? And with that, I'll talk briefly about human rights, science and human rights, I think, which is a natural partnership. And as chair of the Committee on Human Rights for the National Academy of Sciences, I had the privilege for 4 years to oversee a number of scientific events where we sought help on the behalf of scientists, engineers, and health professionals around the world. Now, why is this important? Well, first off, human rights has nothing to do with national identity. It's a basic human concept. On the other hand, I think there are some benefits. And this poll, posted a few years back by the Zogby polling firm, shows how well liked the United States is abroad. In general, and this is citizens on the street in 5 different friendly Arab countries were polled of their impressions of the United States. And you'll notice Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates. Very few of these people had favorable views of the United States. Great majority had unfavorable views. But when polled about their views of United States science and technology and the technological developments, it's a completely different response. People see these things favorably in almost every instance. And I think this represents something that people will see in terms of science in general. It may be the conversation starter that'll work when nothing else has worked. So in terms of human rights, the United States Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences has a committee formed in 1976 during the horrific times of repression in Argentina, Sakharov's imprisonment in the Soviet Union. And the committee was formed to write letters on behalf of the scientists who were beleaguered, advocating for them, and then letters of support to the scientists themselves and their families. And of course, they can't do everything. They focused on the scientists, engineers, and health professionals, because these are the compositions of the academies. And the members of these distinguished academies have colleagues all around the world. So private appeals, oftentimes behind the scenes, turn out to be very effective, and in more than 600 cases, individuals were released from prison, or charges were filed, or justice was pursued because of the actions of this committee. I'll just share a few examples. So Libya is in the news again, but a few years back, Libya was in the news when 5 Bulgarian nurses and a Palestinian physician were on trial in Benghazi for murder. It was charged that they intentionally poisoned children with the HIV virus. Now, the background of the case is complex. Presumably due to shoddy hospital practices, reuse of IV needles without sterilization, an HIV epidemic was in fact initiated in Libya due to neglect, not probably due to anyone's murderous intentions. And this apparently occurred years before the Palestinian physician and the Bulgarian nurses arrived. Nevertheless, a trial was held. It was considered unfair by international standards. They were convicted and sentenced to death by firing squad. And the international outcry caused an overturning of the conviction and a retrial, but they were again convicted and sentenced to the firing squad. This is in spite of the appearance at the trial of Luc Montagnier, the discoverer of the HIV virus, who showed conclusively that the genomic organization of the viruses from the children preceded the arrival of these people in the country, had nothing to do. Nevertheless, they were convicted and sentenced to the firing squad. Now, the Gaddafi regime is now in deep trouble. And of course, this is a political issue that we could discuss, but I think going back a few years, the Gaddafi regime was in trouble then, and they were caught because it was not in their best interest to execute these people at all. The repercussions would have been profound, but they also could not lose face in front of their public. And it was actually the behind-the-scenes activities of at least 2 scientists that I know of who delivered personal appeals to Muammar Gaddafi and his son when invited to Libya for scientific presentations, where they provided a face-saving alternative, again, behind closed doors. And since this is some years in the past, I can divulge what happened. Basically, the idea was that these individuals would be transported to Bulgaria to serve out their sentences. A large amount of money would be privately returned to Libya from EU sources, and Cecilia Sarkozy, the wife of the president of France, would be there to preside over this and take the public attention away. And in fact, it worked. They were released, of course, upon arrival in Bulgarian airport. They were pardoned immediately, and the lives were preserved. It was all done behind the scenes because I think anything public with a brutal dictator often makes things worse. Another example, Dr. Tai Waldesimiat, an Ethiopian intellectual and president of the Ethiopian Teachers Union, along with a number of other Ethiopian educational officials, were charged with treason when they protested the outcome of the elections in Ethiopia. And the elections were clearly below the international standard of fairness. And their trial, they were released on appeal, and he left Ethiopia and was provided a teaching position in the United States by the Committee on Human Rights. His compatriots, however, were convicted. They're in prison right now in Ethiopia. The interest of this was amazing. I was told that Tai Waldesimiat was a national hero in Ethiopia. In the afternoon after our committee met, and Waldesimiat came to thank us, I happened to be taking a taxi cab back from the train station in Baltimore to my home. And the driver, a young man, had a dark skin. I asked him where he's from. He said he's from Ethiopia. I said, "Have you ever heard the name of Tai Waldesimiat?" He stopped the taxi in traffic and turned around and says, "He's a national hero." And at the end of my ride, he wouldn't allow me to pay him the $20 taxi fare because he was so grateful. You know, people like this in prison really aren't treasonous. They probably are oftentimes national heroes doing good things. So I think to support them as we can is important, but sometimes it's pretty frustrating. Binayak Sen, an Indian pediatrician who's devoted his life to treating the impoverished native populations in Chhattisgarh in eastern India. It's a native population that lives in the forests. He was charged with treason because amongst the people he treated were some that were members of the Naxalite revolutionary movement. He was charged with many trumped-up charges. He was on trial. We were able to gain his release on bail by having a letter from 25 Nobel laureates protesting it, but at the trial he was again convicted. He's in prison for life. Now, India is the world's largest democracy, and we don't normally think of it as a site for human rights abuse. On the other hand, human rights abuses can occur anywhere. And in the United States, although I won't talk about the information today, we've had 2 such cases of individuals who were prosecuted unfairly. And I think as scientists, we must remain vigilant in the pursuit of human rights abuses and use our influence where we can to rectify them. So Sen is in prison, but it's not over. Trust me, it's not over. I'll close my discussion by talking about science diplomacy visits, which is something I've been involved in since I became the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I'll talk about 3 visits in particular to countries where the United States government and their countries' governments have basically no common ground. And the program that I represent, the Center for Science Diplomacy, is directed by Vaughn Tarikian, a talented young atmospheric chemist from the University of Virginia. I think there's Vaughn. Here we are on our visit to Cuba, enjoying a cohiba. And shown with him is Max Angerholzer, who's the director of the Richard Lounsbury Foundation. Because these visits, it's very important for you to understand, were totally private in nature. None of the visitors had U.S. government appointments. We provided information, we shared our observations, but we were not working for the U.S. government. We were private citizens. And by obtaining private funds, we could do this clearly and go places where our government officials were not welcome. So the first visit, now just over a year ago, to Havana, Cuba, was very interesting. Of course, probably some of you have been to Cuba. As Norwegians, you're not forbidden to travel there. Americans are forbidden to travel there. The vestiges of the revolution are still there, and something they're very proud of. And of course, we're led to believe at times that time has stopped in Cuba, and there are all these classic old cars that are maintained. But by and large, most vehicles on the road there are dilapidated, and Cuba is having a huge problem. Here is another sign of the revolution at the hotel we stayed at, a very lovely colonial hotel, but where upkeep has not been provided, where funds for restoration and maintenance have not been provided, the place is crumbling. This is part of the old town in Havana. So we were there for several days meeting with Cuban scientific organizations, including this Institute for Biotechnology, the Carlos Findlay Vaccine Institute. And I have to say the science is at a small level by European standards. Cuba is a very poor country, but they've picked carefully where they're going to make their investments. And their major focus has been on prevention of disease as opposed to treatment of end-stage cancer and other problems, which are the focus of a lot of research in the United States. Now, these are the older scientists like myself, with the old bulls, the pre-revolutionary individuals. But of course, Cuban scientists are largely young people, born after the revolution, who have no involvement in the ongoing debate of the Cuban Americans who are angry about the Castro regime. They simply want to do science. And I think this is an opportunity to meet with them. I think we have much to learn from them. Cuba, for example, was heavily infested with malaria before the Cuban Revolution, but by public health standards, they've been able to eliminate it from the country. 30 miles east, Haiti, which is not a communist dictatorship, malaria is endemic. So I think they have something to learn from the Cubans. This is, by the way, the University of Havana, which generates a large number of science students, but they're unable to get meaningful lab experiences. So I think the resource that they have in plenitude is talented young people who want to pursue science. Second visit I'll tell you about briefly is our visit to Pyongyang, North Korea. This was my visa. This is a delegation that visited Pyongyang in December of 2010.